"You're in the wrong place, miss." The man filling the doorway had the build of someone accustomed to using his size as an argument, and he looked at Louisa Graves the way certain men look at things that arrive uninvited, like a problem that hadn't been scheduled and wasn't welcome. "Santa Fe's back the way you came. I suggest you use it." Louisa set her traveling case down on the wooden step, squared her shoulders, and said, "I was hired to manage the accounts for Redstone Creek Ranch. I'd like to start today." She had been through too much to be stopped by a large man and a loud voice. She had decided that before she left Georgia, and she was not in the habit of changing her decisions halfway through a desert. If you have ever stood at the threshold of something that felt too large and chose to walk through it anyway, this story is for you. Subscribe to Dusty Heart and stay until the very end, because nothing about what happened at Redstone Creek Ranch was what it appeared to be. Not the ledgers, not the land, and not the quiet man Louisa met at the water trough on her first morning. She had traveled 6 days to get here, 6 days through heat that rose off the red rock country of New Mexico territory like something alive and deliberately hostile. 6 days on stage roads that had not improved since whatever optimist had first laid them out, eating dust and hardtack and drinking water that tasted of the tin canteen it lived in. 6 days thinking about the letter she kept in the inside pocket of her traveling coat. The letter from the Redstone Creek Land Trust offering her a position managing supply contracts and payroll accounts at a remote cattle operation in the high desert north of Albuquerque. She had accepted without asking many questions. After what had happened to her father's farm in Savannah, after the crop lean man and the modified contracts, and the morning she had stood in their kitchen, watching a sheriff's deputy pin a notice to the door, she had lost her taste for comfortable arrangements. Comfortable arrangements were how you got taken. Uncomfortable ones at least told you the truth about where you stood. She picked up her case and walked past the man in the doorway. He let her, which surprised her. Sometimes the bluff was all they had. She had been walking toward the main ranch house when she heard it, the steady rhythm of iron on iron. Someone working. She stopped and looked to her left, where a collapsed section of stone water cistern wall was being reset by a man working alone in the early afternoon heat. He had already cleared the rubble. He was now laying courses of flat desert stone with the careful patience of someone who understood that a wall built wrong would have to be torn down and built again, and he would rather not build it twice. He didn't look up when she stopped. He was lean in the way that actual labor produces, not performed, not deliberate, simply the shape a body takes when it works outdoors for years and has long since stopped thinking about it. His coat was sun-bleached at the shoulders. His hat had the look of something that had been through hard weather more than once and expected to go through more. His hands, when she caught a glimpse of them, had the kind of scarring at the knuckles that came from working stone and wire, rather than from anything gentler. He looked up. His eyes were a dark gray that shifted toward green depending on how the desert light hit them, and they held her gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who was not performing calm, who simply was calm, the way a rock face is calm, because it has not found a good reason to be otherwise. "You looking for the ranch house?" he said. His voice was quiet without being soft, deliberate, the voice of a man who had decided somewhere along the way that words were worth spending carefully. "I found it," Louisa said. "I'm the new accounts clerk." He looked at her for one more moment, not assessing, exactly, more like noting, then returned to the cistern wall. She walked on, and she did not look back, though she was aware, in some way she couldn't quite account for, that she wanted to. The ranch foreman's name was Sumner Hatch. He was a compact, sharp-featured man in his late 40s with the kind of energy that never quite settled, and he had made his opinion of her hiring clear within the first 30 seconds of their introduction. He repeated her job title back to her like he was testing it for weight. He asked her where she had worked before, when she told him 3 years managing accounts for a textile merchant in Savannah, and before that her father's farm. He said, "Farm in Georgia. You know cattle operations?" "I know numbers," Louisa said. "Numbers are the same in every industry." Hatch made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and led her to the records room. She understood immediately why the position existed. The records room was a disaster in the specific way of a space where someone with authority and no system had been making decisions for years. Ledger books were stacked without sequence. Supply receipts were folded into a glass jar. A stack of water rights agreements, actual legal instruments with territorial court stamps, was being used as a surface for a box of pencils which had rolled off and left marks on the topmost document. Louisa picked it up. It was a water access agreement dated 3 years prior, granting grazing and irrigation rights to a homestead operation to the east of the main ranch property. The agreed consideration was listed as $40 per season. In pencil, recently she could tell by the sharpness of the mark. Someone had crossed out 40 and written 12. She set it down carefully. "How long have the records been in this condition?" she asked. "They're not in any condition," Hatch said. "That's why you're here." He left her with the boxes and the pencil-marked agreement, and the particular certainty that she had just stepped into something considerably more complicated than a bookkeeping position. That evening, the ranch hands ate supper in a long timber building that smelled of coffee and wood smoke and years of use. There were about 15 men. Louisa sat at the end of one table, eating quietly, watching. Hatch presided from the head of the center table and talked at length about efficiency and proper procedure, and the standards he maintained on behalf of the operation's investors. Most of the men ate and said nothing. Then the door opened. The man from the cistern came in, pulled off his hat, and sat at the far end of Louisa's table without ceremony. He served himself from the pot and began eating with the same quality of complete attention she had seen him give the stonework that afternoon. Fully present, entirely without performance. Hatch did not acknowledge him. The man did not acknowledge Hatch, but the room shifted when he arrived, the way a room shifts when a second center of gravity enters, and everyone quietly recalibrates, without admitting they have done so. A young ranch hand across from Louisa, 19 or 20, with sun-chapped ears and the careful posture of someone still figuring out how much space he was allowed to take up, leaned in and said quietly, "That's Cole. He mostly runs the far line alone. South Range." "Does he live here?" Louisa asked. "Got a place up past the Red Rocks, north of the upper pasture. Comes and goes when he sees fit." The young man paused. Nobody tells him otherwise. "Why not?" He looked at his plate. "Don't know exactly, just nobody does." Louisa looked down the table at the man named Cole. At one point he glanced up and found her already looking. He held the look for a moment, one beat, direct and unhurried, then returned to his supper without expression. It was the least dramatic exchange she could imagine. It was also the most unsettling thing that had happened to her all day, and she had been stopped in a doorway by a man twice her size. She worked until past midnight on her first night, organizing by lamplight what she could reach without losing the sequence. What she found in those first hours was enough to keep her from sleeping. The pattern was subtle. That was the thing about it. It was designed to look like carelessness, like the inevitable entropy of a busy operation and a disorganized foreman. But Louisa had spent 3 years in textile accounting, where margins were thin and creative record-keeping was an industry tradition, and she knew what carelessness looked like, and she knew what it was covering for. Water rights agreements with altered payment figures, supply deliveries recorded as received with no corresponding invoices, payments going to a holding entity with no name she could find in any of the official trust documents, each piece small enough to be a clerical error, together arranged in sequence, something that was not an error at all. She was still sitting with an open ledger in front of her when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Cole stood in the doorway, not leaning, not casual about it, just standing with the complete stillness of a man who had decided to stop and was therefore stopped. "Late to still be working," he said. "The books are worse than I thought." He looked at the ledger on the table. His eyes moved across the open page with the specific recognition of someone who had seen it before and was not surprised by what was there. "When were these last properly kept?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, before Hatch took over the accounting side, about 2.5 years ago. "What changed 2.5 years ago?" He looked at her. The lamp threw long shadows across the room, and the desert night outside the window was the particular deep black of country far from any town. She had the clear impression that he was calculating something, not coldly, but the way a person calculates when they are deciding how much honesty the moment can hold. "Things changed," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked at the ledger once more. "Don't work alone after the rest of the house is down," he said. Lock the door when you leave." Then he was gone. She sat with that for a long time after his footsteps faded. It was not a threat. She had heard enough threats in her life to know the difference. It was a warning, the kind someone offers when they know something they cannot yet say out loud. She locked the door and went to bed and did not sleep well. 3 days later, she found the water rights documents. They were what she had been looking for, the original land and water filing records that would show her the actual boundary of what Redstone Creek Ranch held, versus what its current book suggested it was paying to access. They should have been in a strongbox. They were in a crate under a broken shelf, mixed with supply receipts from 4 years prior. She spread them on the table and began reading. Deed of water access, original survey, 2 secondary water agreements from homestead operations to the east and north. A territorial filing from 18 months ago. Then she found the transfer document, and she stopped. It was a conveyance of water access rights, a legal instrument conveying controlling interest in a spring-fed creek parcel and its associated downstream access, approximately 900 acres of water-adjacent land, to an entity called Consolidated Desert Holdings. The listed consideration was $2. Louisa read it 3 times. She turned it over. She examined the territorial stamp. She looked at the signature authorizing the transfer. It was not a name she recognized, but the document had been filed. It was legal, on its face, and at the bottom, in the notation line where the filing clerk recorded the nature of the transaction, someone had written, "Routine administrative reallocation per trust instrument." 900 acres of water-adjacent land in high desert country, where water access was worth more than the cattle on top of it, transferred for $2 and characterized as routine administration. She folded the document and placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, next to the letter that had brought her here. She found Cole at the water trough the next morning before the rest of the ranch was fully awake, filling the tank for the horse paddock. Moving with that same economy she had come to associate with him entirely. Nothing wasted, nothing extra, everything going somewhere useful. "I need to ask you something," she said. He set down the bucket and looked at her. "Do you know the name Consolidated Desert Holdings?" The stillness that came over him was not the stillness of a man who didn't recognize the name. It was the stillness of a man who recognized it completely and was deciding in real time what to do with that fact. "Where did you see that name?" he said. "On a water rights transfer, 900 acres. Filed 18 months ago. Consideration listed as $2. She watched his face. "That land is worth considerably more than $2. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Do you know who authorized the transfer?" He picked up the bucket, set it down again. "I know who signed the document," he said. "I don't know who arranged it. Those aren't the same person." "Cole," she stepped closer. "If you know something about what's happening in those records, I need you to tell me. I was hired to manage the accounts for this operation. If someone is stealing from it—" "They are," he said quietly. She went very still. "They have been," he continued, in the flat tone of someone stating a fact rather than making an accusation. "The water rights, the supply invoices, the altered payment agreements, it's all part of the same operation. Someone is assembling something piece by piece through these books, and the workers on this property are paying for it out of their wages while it happens." She stared at him. "And you've known this?" "Yes." "How long?" He looked at her with that measuring quality she was learning to read not as coldness, but as the specific expression of a man who carried a great deal, and had decided a long time ago not to let it show as weight. "Long enough," he said. Hatch's voice cut across the yard before she could push further. Cole picked up the bucket. "We'll talk later," he said quietly. "Keep that transfer document somewhere only you can access." He walked away. Louisa stood in the dry morning heat of the New Mexico desert and felt the particular sensation of someone who has just stepped onto a floor and realized it has no depth to it, that what she had taken for solid ground was something she was going to have to see all the way through, because she recognized this pattern. She had been inside its consequences before, and she was not willing to stand at the edge of it again and do nothing. She had done nothing once. She had been 23, and she had not understood what the lien papers meant until it was too late, and her father had signed them because a man named Caldwell had told him it was standard procedure. And she had believed that a man with a suit and a notary stamp would not lie to a working farmer's face. She had been wrong about that. She was not going to be wrong about anything else. Over the following week, Louisa built a method. She arrived at the records room before anyone else and worked in layers, cataloging first, then indexing, then the slow work of comparison. She kept what she flagged in a locked valise she had brought in her traveling case. She kept her face neutral when she saw Hatch in the yard. And she asked questions that sounded like routine accounting questions, and she watched. On the sixth evening, she heard two men talking behind the equipment shed. She should have kept walking. She didn't. 3 more parcels. He wants the Upper Canyon water agreements included before the summer filing period. That's another 600 acres. That's why he wants it done before August. Once the seasonal surveys go in, the mining consortium has what they need to present to the federal land office. And the woman they sent, the one doing the ledgers. A pause. She won't find the pattern before August. Make sure the original payment ledgers from '84 are pulled from the records room before she gets to that section. Louisa pressed her back against the wall of the shed and breathed. She had already found the 1884 payment ledgers. She had already copied the most significant entries into her own notes. But now she understood something she hadn't before. They knew she was there. They were moving because of her, which meant she had no time left to be methodical. She found Cole's place past the red rock formation north of the upper pasture, a low adobe structure with a lantern burning in the window, and the door standing open against the evening heat, the door of a man with nothing to hide and no reason to close himself in. She knocked on the frame anyway. He looked up from a length of rope he was working some repair into, the same quality of resting work she'd seen him do every time he wasn't doing anything else. The cabin held a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a shelf of books that surprised her. History, territorial law, engineering texts, a Bible that looked genuinely used rather than decoratively placed. She sat down across from him. "Tell me who you really are," she said. He set the rope down. For a moment there was nothing but the stove and the desert night outside. "I told you my name," he said. "You told me part of it." She held his gaze. "I heard 2 men behind the equipment shed tonight. They're planning to move the 1884 ledgers before I reach that section. I've already reached it. I've already copied the relevant entries, but I can't do what needs to be done with what I have alone." She kept her voice level. "So I am asking you directly. What do you know? How long have you known it? And why does a line rider know more about this operation than anyone else on the payroll?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I've been watching Sumner Hatch and his associates for 14 months, he said. "Since the first water rights transfer went through without proper trust authorization. And you haven't reported it because reporting it requires documented evidence and not suspicion. Because Hatch's principal investor has 3 attorneys with territorial court experience." He paused. "And because the person with legal standing to contest the transfers formally cannot act in the open without Hatch moving everything through his legal channels before the evidence is secured." He met her eyes. "This isn't one operation. It's a system. Hatch is assembling water-adjacent parcels from at least 4 separate properties in this territory and packaging them for sale to a silver mining consortium out of Denver. The Redstone Creek parcels are the anchor of the whole scheme. Without them, the water access corridor has a gap. With them, the mining company can file for federal extraction rights across the entire basin." Louisa listened to all of this with the specific attention she gave things she intended to remember exactly. "You're not describing this the way someone describes something they heard secondhand," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite regret. The expression of a man who has been walking toward a decision for a long time and has finally arrived at it. "No," he said, "I'm not." He stood up, went to the shelf of law texts, and from behind a volume on water rights in territorial jurisdictions, removed a document. He placed it on the table in front of her. She unfolded it. It was a correspondence from the New Mexico Territorial Land and Water Office, addressed to Coleman Alden Maddox, Redstone Creek Land Trust, New Mexico Territory. Louisa read the name twice, then she looked up at him. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes that she now understood were not simply the eyes of a man comfortable with silence. They were the eyes of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment with the kind of patience that only makes sense once you understand what it costs. "Maddox," she said. "Yes." "This is your ranch." "Yes." She looked at the simple bed, the functional furniture, the rope he had been repairing, the coat by the door that had seen 2 New Mexico winters at least. "You own this entire operation," she said, "and you've been working it." "The way I always have," he said, "the way my father did." The silence between them had weight. She had to think through it rather than past it. "Why?" she said finally. He looked at the stove. "When I came back from a year in Denver handling the legal side of the trust holdings, the first thing I found was that the management arrangement Hatch was running had turned this property into something my father would not have recognized. Workers paid under their contracted rate, supply accounts inflated, and the water rights, the thing my grandfather built this operation around, being quietly moved into a structure I didn't authorize and didn't understand yet." He paused. "I could have walked in and fired everyone and started from nothing, but I'd seen what happened to the Henderson outfit north of here when the owner moved fast and announced himself before he had the evidence in hand. Hatch's associates had the documents moved and the accounts restructured before the sheriff finished his coffee. They lost everything and couldn't prove why. So you hid yourself instead." "I worked," he said. "I watched. I learned exactly what was happening and who was doing what to whom. And then I arranged for someone with proper accounting experience to be brought in through the trust's hiring process." The air went out of the room. Louisa sat very still. "You arranged for me to be hired," she said. "Yes." "You knew who I was before I arrived." "I knew you had managed your father's farm accounts for 6 years. I knew that your father's land in Georgia was taken through a modified crop lien scheme 2 years ago. I knew that you understood, from personal experience, exactly what a falsified financial instrument looks like." He held her gaze without flinching from it. "I needed someone who would recognize what was in those records as something real, not as an abstract accounting irregularity, as something that had already happened to someone and could happen again." Louisa looked at him for a long time. "You don't get to make that choice for me," she said. "You don't get to recruit me for something without telling me what I'm being recruited for. My history is not yours to use without my knowledge." "You're right," he said. "That was wrong. I'm telling you now." She stood up and crossed to the window and looked out at the desert dark, where the red rock formations were black shapes against a sky full of stars. She thought about her father, about the lien papers, about the morning the deputy came, and about the winter after, which her father had not survived with anything intact that mattered. She had come here because she had needed somewhere to go, but she was staying. She understood this with complete clarity standing at this window, because this was the same thing that had taken her family, wearing a different name and a different set of documents, and she was not going to watch it work again while she stood on the outside of it. She turned back. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something in him shifted. Not relief, exactly. More the posture of a man who has been holding something at considerable effort and has just been allowed to set it down for a moment. "Everything in those records," he said, "documented, cross-referenced, irrefutable. How much time do we have?" "Hatch meets with the Denver Consortium representative in 3 weeks. If we don't have a complete documented case filed before that meeting, the final water parcel transfers go through and the corridor is complete. After that, the mining company files for federal access rights, and by the time any territorial contestation could work through the courts, the legal structure is too entrenched to unwind in time to matter." Louisa thought about the scope of what she had already found and what she suspected remained. "I need access to everything the trust holds," she said. "Every correspondence with Hatch, every transaction record from the beginning of his management arrangement. You'll have it. And I need you to understand something." She looked at him directly. "I am not doing this for you. I am not doing this for the ranch. I am doing this because the workers on this property are being robbed of wages they earned, and the homestead families to the east are about to lose water access they need to survive, and nobody fought for my father when it was his turn. I am not willing to be the person who did nothing again." He held her gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I asked you." She picked up her coat. "We start at first light," she said. She walked back down past the red rock formations toward the main house, and the desert night was enormous and indifferent around her, and she felt, not peace exactly, but the specific clarity of a person who has finally found the thing they came for and knows exactly what they are going to do about it. The strongbox Maddox brought to the records room the following morning held 3 years of correspondence between the land trust and Hatch's principal investor, a man named Greaves, who operated out of Denver under the umbrella of the mining consortium. Letters, amendments, contracts, financial instruments that, read in isolation, looked like standard business arrangements, and read in sequence, told a different story entirely. By the time Louisa stopped working that night, she had found it. The water access parcels being assembled were not random. Each transfer moved a specific parcel, always parcels with documented spring access, always parcels adjacent to the one before, always parcels that together formed a continuous corridor running from the eastern edge of the Redstone Creek Trust land to a boundary shared with a federal mineral extraction survey zone. In the right hands, this corridor was worth tens of thousands of dollars to a mining operation that needed water access to process silver ore. Hatch was not a corrupt ranch manager skimming supply accounts. He was a land speculator running a systematic acquisition scheme across multiple New Mexico properties, assembling a water corridor piece by piece through falsified documents and the slow manipulation of men who trusted the paperwork they were handed. And the Redstone Creek parcels were the keystone. Without them, there was a gap. With them, the thing was complete. She went to find Maddox. She told him. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "I suspected the mining connection. I didn't have documentation of the corridor sequence." "There's something else." She spread the documents on his table and traced the map she had sketched. "He needs 3 more parcels, the Upper Canyon water agreements. He wants them transferred before the August surveys." Maddox looked at the map for a long time. Once the corridor is complete, he doesn't need the ranch management arrangement anymore. He can dissolve it. Take his fee from the consortium sale, disappear. And every worker on this property loses their position, and the Whitaker family and the Delgado family to the east lose the water access their livestock depend on. She looked at him. "We have less than 3 weeks." "We have less than that," his jaw set. "I received a telegraph from Hatch's office this afternoon. The consortium representative is coming to the territory early. He arrives in 12 days. 12 days. Louisa felt the pressure of it, not as panic but as focus, the specific clarity of a deadline that will not negotiate. "Then we move faster," she said. "The Territorial Water Office in Albuquerque. To file a formal contestation of the transfers, we need the original trust documentation, documented evidence of the fraud pattern, and signed statements from affected parties." She paused. "And there's a complication." "The first transfer document," he said. "Your signature authorizes it." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Greaves will argue that the entire scheme had owner authorization from the beginning." "I know." His voice was quiet and even. "That's exactly what he'll argue. It's his insurance. The first document exists to shift liability if anyone comes after him. If the owner authorized the beginning, the subsequent transfers read as continuation of authorized activity." "Why didn't you tell me this immediately?" "Because I needed you to understand the scope of the fraud first, before I showed you the part that complicates it." Louisa thought about this for a long time. The stove had burned low and neither of them moved to tend it. "There's a way to argue it," she said finally. "If the court can see that every subsequent transfer was executed without your knowledge or signature, that Hatch used the first document as a false precedent to establish what he called owner cooperation for everything that followed, then the pattern itself becomes the proof. The fraud didn't stop at one transfer. It continued without you. That's what demonstrates the first signature was obtained through misrepresentation." He looked at her. "That's the argument." "Then that's the argument I build." She pulled on her coat. "Get some sleep. We both need to function tomorrow." She walked to the door. "Louisa." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. Simple, undecorated. The real thing, which is always quieter than any performance of it. She didn't turn around. "Thank me when it's done," she said, and walked out into the desert dark. The young ranch hand, Roy Baines, came to the records room the next morning with his cap in both hands, and the look of someone who has a reason for being there that has nothing to do with the official reason. "Brought you coffee," he said. "Cook said you missed breakfast." She made room on the table. He set the cup down and didn't leave, and she could see from the way he was standing, weight shifted forward, not quite settled, that the coffee was not what he had come to say. "Something on your mind," she said. He looked at the ledger open on the table. Then he looked at her. "Some of the men were talking last night. They're saying Hatch brought you in to make the books look clean before a consortium inspection, that you work for the Denver outfit." Louisa set her pen down and turned to face him directly. "I work for the land trust," she said, "not for Hatch, not for anyone in Denver." "But you were hired through the management arrangement, so?" "I was hired to document the actual financial state of this operation. The real numbers, not the version that has been presented to the men on this payroll." She held his gaze. "Roy, have you ever been paid less than your contract specified?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All of us have." Hatch said the market shifted, that the trust had authorized an adjustment. "We didn't have papers showing different." "Your original contract stated what rate?" He told her. She found his entry in the ledger and held it so he could see both figures, the contracted rate and the reduced figure in the margin beside it. He read it. His face moved through several things in quick succession: confusion, then comprehension, then something harder and older that didn't have a clean name but that she recognized, because she had felt it herself, standing in a kitchen in Georgia reading papers she had been too young and too trusting to have read sooner. "That's what they owe me," he said quietly. "Yes, and I'm building the documentation to prove it to a territorial court." He looked at her for a moment. "Does Cole know?" he asked. The certainty with which he asked it, as though Cole was the relevant variable, as though Roy Baines had understood on some instinctive level that this quiet man was the axis around which the important questions turned, told her something she filed away. "Yes," she said. "He knows." Roy nodded slowly as though something had been confirmed rather than revealed. "All right." He took a drink of his coffee. "What do you need from us?" She felt something shift in her chest, the specific weight of understanding that what she was carrying was no longer only hers. "Any documents you were given," she said. "Original contracts, pay records, any written communication about wage adjustments, everything you have." "I'll talk to the others," he said. "Some of the men kept their papers. Didn't know why at the time. Just felt like the kind of thing you didn't throw away." He left. She turned back to the ledger. The morning light was fully in the room now, and outside the ranch moved with its ordinary rhythms. Horses and cattle and men and the indifferent forward motion of a working day that had no idea what was building beneath the surface of its ordinaries. They rode for Albuquerque 8 days later before sunrise, with a document case across Louisa's saddle and the copy of the most critical wage fraud entries, flat against her ribs beneath her coat. Roy and 4 of the other ranch hands had spent 2 evenings signing sworn statements. Louisa had spent those same evenings cross-referencing every statement against the corresponding ledger entries until the pattern of wage theft across 22 months was irrefutable on paper. Maddox had 2 horses ready in the dark of the stable without being asked. They made good time through the high desert. The road dropped gradually toward the Rio Grande Valley, and Maddox rode beside her, not ahead, not taking the lead as though it were simply his to take, but matching her pace, staying even, moving back when the trail required it and forward again when it widened. It was a small thing, she noticed it anyway. About 2 hours into the ride, he said, "Tell me about your father's farm." She looked straight ahead. "Why?" "Because you've been carrying it since the day you arrived, and I'd rather know what I'm asking you to carry alongside than pretend it isn't there." She almost refused. She was good at refusal in the efficient way of someone who had learned that offering personal information was a form of exposure. But he had already shown her the letter with his name on it, which was its own kind of exposure, and they were riding toward a territorial court together. "He built it from 40 acres, she said. "Grew it to just over 200 by the time I finished school. He wasn't a sophisticated man. He believed that a signed contract meant what it said." She paused. "A man named Caldwell came through our county in the spring of 1883 with a crop consolidation arrangement. The paperwork my father signed transferred his mortgage authority to the Consolidation Trust. He didn't understand that. He thought he was securing an investment. And Caldwell triggered the foreclosure provisions. Deliberately, at exactly the moment required to activate them. She looked at the red rock country around them. He ended up with 160 consolidated acres he sold to a timber interest before the end of the year. Maddox was quiet for a long moment. Your father. The compression in her chest was familiar by now, worn smooth like a stone she had carried until she stopped noticing its weight. He didn't know how to keep living when the thing he had built was gone, she said simply. So he didn't by that next winter. The road moved under them in silence. I'm sorry, Maddox said. Don't be sorry, she said. Be useful, which is what we're doing. He didn't push. She was grateful for that in a way she couldn't have easily articulated. They reached the Territorial Water and Land Office in Albuquerque in the late afternoon of the second day, having ridden through the first night with two of Hatch's hired associates behind them, at a distance that was not coincidental. They had outpaced them to the city, where witnesses made the risk too high. The clerk at the land office was locking the front door when they came up the steps. Office is closed, he said. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow was not a door Louisa was willing to open. She told the clerk she needed to speak with the water rights adjudicator tonight, and she told him why, and she told him that the man who had arranged the fraud was arriving in the territory within 72 hours. She said it plainly, without performance, with the voice of someone who has not come this far to be turned away by a closing time. The clerk went inside. 8 minutes later, he came back and said that Adjudicator Holcomb would see her. Louisa picked up the document case and walked inside. The adjudicator was a spare, deliberate man in his 60s, who had the eyes of someone who had spent 30 years listening to people tell him things, and had developed a rigorous method for distinguishing the real from the constructed. He looked at the first document she placed in front of him, and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. Maddox took the chair against the wall, present, not inserting himself, letting her carry it. She walked Holcomb through the document sequence exactly as she had built it. The wage fraud first. Original contracts beside the altered ledger, side by side, the divergence visible without narration, because a man of 30 years' experience did not need things explained. He needed them organized. He asked 4 questions in the first 20 minutes, all of them precise, all of them the 4 questions she had anticipated on the ride, and had organized the supporting materials to answer. She answered each one with a specific document reference. When she reached the water rights sequence and placed the corridor map beside the 6 transfer documents in chronological order, Holcomb stopped. He looked at the map. He looked at the transfers. He looked at the map again. This is a deliberate assembly, he said. Yes, Your Honor. Executed over 14 months through 6 fraudulent transfers, each targeting parcels with documented spring water access and adjacency to the previous transfer. The completed corridor connects the eastern boundary of the Redstone Creek Trust land to the Federal Mineral Extraction Survey Zone. Current value to a mining consortium seeking water access for ore processing, conservatively between $30,000 and $50,000. Holcomb set the map down with the controlled expression of a man who has built his life on the proposition that legal process exists for a reason and is regularly confronted with evidence that certain people have decided they are exempt from it. He read the sworn statements from the ranch hands one at a time, slowly, without rushing. When he finished the last one, he looked up. 20 workers, he said. 22 months of systematic underpayment. He paused. And the authorization document. She placed it. His signature on the first transfer. He read it completely. Then he looked past her at Maddox against the wall. Mr. Maddox, he said. Coleman Alden Maddox, this is your trust. Yes. You signed the first transfer. I did. Under the representation by my management agent that it was a standard administrative reallocation of a secondary water access parcel. I had granted Hatch a standing authorization to execute routine administrative matters on behalf of the trust. He used that authorization to characterize a fraudulent conveyance as routine. The evidence that it was fraudulent is in every subsequent action he took without returning to me for authorization. A genuine administrative reallocation would have required documentation at each stage. The fraud required him never to come back. Holcomb looked between them. You assembled this together. Yes, Louisa said. You have a personal history with this type of fraud. She met his gaze directly. My family's farm in Georgia was taken through an identical mechanism in 1883. That experience does not compromise my analysis of these documents. It qualifies it. I know exactly what this pattern looks like because I have lived inside its consequences. That is not bias. That is expertise. Holcomb held her gaze for a moment. Then he gathered the document set and squared it neatly on his desk. I'll need 2 hours, he said. There's a reasonable hotel on the main street. Come back at 8. At 8 o'clock, he issued an emergency injunction freezing all Consolidated Desert Holdings transactions in the territory pending investigation. He directed the Territorial Marshal's office to secure the Redstone Creek records room and remove Hatch from the property. He issued a warrant for Greaves, the Denver investor, upon his entry into the territory. And he looked at Louisa across his desk, with the expression of a man who had been behind this bench for a long time and had arrived at a clear opinion. I've seen fraud cases for nearly 30 years, he said. I have not seen one assembled this completely and this fast. He tapped the document set. You built this in 8 days. I had the right documents, Louisa said, and I knew what I was looking at. You knew, he agreed. That is not a common thing. Roy Baines and 4 ranch hands were waiting on the steps of the land office when Louisa and Maddox came out. Roy had ridden through the night. He had the look of it, and he was holding a brown-covered ledger in both hands. Hatch came for the records room at sundown, he said. Found us already in it. He held up the ledger. He took a horse from the stable and rode west. We let him go. Figured that was the marshal's business. It is, Louisa said. She took the ledger and opened it and confirmed the entries she had memorized. Original ink, notary stamps. The physical document, no lawyer could argue, was a secondary copy. Roy looked at her, then at Maddox, with the complicated expression of a young man, adjusting his understanding of a person and deciding whether the adjustment makes them larger or smaller. The men were talking on the ride-in, Roy said carefully, saying you own the place. Yes, Maddox said. You always did. Yes. Roy was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you say so? Maddox looked at him steadily. Because it didn't change what needed to be done. And because a man who announces what he owns before he's earned the right to be trusted usually loses both. Roy thought about that. Then he straightened in his saddle in the particular way of a young man who has just seen something he needed to see, that the world can work the way it is supposed to work, sometimes when someone is willing to do the necessary thing and stay with it until it's finished. All right, he said. The word carried everything he wasn't saying. Greaves arrived in the territory 3 days later and was met at the stage road by the Territorial Marshal's deputy, carrying an injunction with the court seal and a warrant with his name on it. He had a lawyer with him, and the lawyer had arguments, and none of the arguments held because the documents were already in the court's possession, and the fraud was already documented to a standard that his vocabulary of procedural objection could not dismantle. Louisa was there. She watched Greaves read the injunction in the attorney's hands, watched his face go through its stages, watched him look up and find her looking at him. For one moment, something real moved through his expression, the specific recognition of a man who had built his entire operation on the premise that ordinary people do not fight back, encountering the evidence that this premise had failed completely. Then his face closed down, and his lawyer began to talk, and the machinery of his defense commenced. But the injunction was already filed. The warrant was already signed. The workers of Redstone Creek Ranch had 20 sworn statements, a court seal, and the knowledge that the woman who had arrived with a traveling case and a refusal to be stopped had done exactly what she came to do. The ride back to the ranch took most of the following day, and no one talked much. There are kinds of exhaustion that don't need words to fill them, and everyone in that group, Louisa, Maddox, Roy, the ranch hands who had ridden through 2 nights and believed in something they couldn't fully articulate, was carrying the specific weight of people who have done something real and are still in the process of understanding its full cost and its full return. Maddox rode beside her, not ahead. At some point in the long afternoon, with the red rock country spread out around them and the sky the particular deep blue of high desert autumn, she said, "My father would have liked to see this." It was the first time she had been able to say it, simply, without the compression that usually accompanied it. The weight of what came after, the empty farm, the letter from the county clerk, the winter. She said it the way you can only say a thing, when you have finally done the work that earns the right to say it without flinching. Maddox didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply rode beside her in the way of a man who understood that some things don't need a response, that the right thing to do was simply to be there and let the statement exist in the air between them without rushing to cover it. After a while, she said, 6 months. He looked at her. "I want to know what this is when there's nothing urgent holding it together," she said. "When it's ordinary. When it's just two people who know who the other one actually is." She looked at the road ahead. "Ask me then." He was quiet for a moment then. "That's a fair answer." "It's an honest one," she said, "which you told me you wanted." Something moved in his expression, the quiet version of a smile, which on his face was more affecting than any louder version would have been. 6 months, he said. 6 months, she agreed. The Redstone Creek records room looked different when she returned to it, organized, indexed. Every ledger in sequence, every land document in its proper file, every contract cross-referenced and dated and recoverable. The shape of a space that had been given the thing it needed, which was someone willing to do the work of seeing it clearly. It was the job she had been hired to do. It was also considerably more than that, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself. The territorial proceedings ran for the better part of 4 months. Greaves was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct a territorial investigation. Hatch, who had cooperated with the prosecutor in exchange for a reduced charge, provided testimony that filled in the mechanisms Louisa's documents had already outlined. The water rights transfers were voided. The 20 workers received full restitution of the wages that had been taken from them, plus interest, from the liquidated assets of Consolidated Desert Holdings. The Whittaker family and the Delgado family to the east of the ranch kept their water access. Dale Whittaker came to find Louisa before the proceedings closed. He was a large, weathered man in his 50s, and he took off his hat and held it in both hands, and told her that his wife had asked him to find her, and that his wife had not slept the night before the verdict, and that his wife wanted her to know. Not just for the legal part, but for the fact that somebody had come. Louisa told him to tell her she was welcome. She told him to tell her also that the next time anyone arrived with papers that needed signing, they should read every line, every word, before they touched a pen. He almost smiled. He put his hat back on and walked away. Maddox came to stand beside her. "He's right," he said. "About which part?" "That someone came." He looked at her. The documents were there. The law was there. The difference was a woman who arrived with a traveling case and decided the work was worth doing. She looked at the street, at Roy Baines explaining something to the other ranch hands with his characteristic energy, at the Whittakers climbing into their wagon, at the particular light of a New Mexico autumn afternoon, which was merciless and golden, and entirely indifferent to the significance of what had just happened in the courthouse behind them. "It shouldn't have been necessary," she said. "Someone should have been paying attention long before I arrived." "Yes," he said, "they should have." They stood there together in the last of the afternoon light, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying right then, and they had both learned. In the months since a woman with a traveling case had walked past a man, blocking a doorway, that silence between two people who understand each other is not an absence of something. It is the thing itself. 6 months later, on a January evening, with the desert cold coming down off the high country, and the stars over New Mexico so dense they looked like something you could reach into, Louisa stood at the edge of the upper pasture, where the red rock formations opened onto a view of the entire basin, the ranch land, the creek lines, the homestead operations to the east, where the Whittaker and Delgado families were rebuilding what the scheme had tried to take from them. Maddox stood beside her. He said, 6 months. She said, "I know." He looked at her in the way she had come to understand was not simply his expression, but his most honest one. The look he wore when he was not performing anything, when there was nothing to manage and no calculation required. The look of a man who is simply where he is, with who he is with, and finds that sufficient. "Stay," he said. One word. No decoration. The real thing, offered the way real things are offered, quietly, directly, without ceremony, because ceremony is what you use when you are not sure the thing itself is enough. She looked at the basin spread below them in the winter dark. She had come here with nothing but a traveling case and a refusal, and the particular determination of a woman who had already lost the worst thing and survived it, and decided that surviving was not the same as stopping. She had not come here looking for this. She had been too practical for too long to look for something she couldn't account for in a ledger. But she had found it anyway, in a man who fixed cistern walls because they needed fixing and ate at the workers' table, because those were the men whose lives were connected to his, and who had spent a year watching people be robbed and working quietly to stop it in a way that would last. Not because someone told him to, because he could not stand watching it and doing nothing. She knew who he was. He knew who she was. Not the versions they had each constructed for safety, but the actual versions. The ones with the losses and the specific knowledge those losses produced and the choices made in the aftermath. "I was always going to stay," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." And the desert night was enormous around them, and the stars were indifferent the way stars always are, and below them the basin held what they had fought for, and what they had found here, in this red rock country, in the particular and necessary way of things that are worth having, not because they came easily, but because they were true.